Thank you so much to Gil for having me, and to Sylvia as well, and also to all of our co-sponsors. It's been a special pleasure to be here and to be introduced by Gil. That was an incredibly charitable and I think gracious and lovely introduction. I should say that Gil and I are deep, old friends. He's one of my oldest friends from graduate school, and so it's an absolute delight to be here with him to present this. I'm going to apologize, which is that it's difficult to know in advance how large an audience one has, and I sort of follow relatively standard historian conventions of reading from a script to be really precise about my language. But I'll try not to be too overly rigid in terms of presentation, and certainly I hope that we'll be able to have like a more informal conversation at the end of it, and hopefully there'll be some good material to ask questions about. So on June 27, 1925, the citizens of Markle, Indiana, put a bull on trial for crimes against the herd. 1,200 spectators from Huntington, Uniondale, and the surrounding countryside flooded into Markle for the trial. F.H. Bowers, a local attorney, promised the bull a robust defense, but the jury convicted. Judge Simmons handed down a sentence of death, and with that, the bull was summarily executed. A minister delivered a funeral oration that probably followed a script furnished for the occasion by the United States Department of Agriculture. The minister then would have warned the audience that the executed bull threatened, quote, the growth and development of the human race. Let us bury him so deep and seal his tomb so tight that both he and his posterity will be lost to this world forever. The bull was a scrub. The USDA defined a scrub bull as an inferior bull of mixed or unknown breeding. In its Better Sires, Better Stock campaign, which I'll refer to as the campaign from here on out, the USDA designated scrub sires, scrub male animals used for stud, as threats to the nation because of their capacities to pass on undesirable characteristics to their offspring. Between 1919 and 1933, the Cooperative Extension Service of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, or the Extension Service, organized scrub sire trials in every region of the country as one part of this broader campaign. The trials, often held at county fairs, drew hundreds and sometimes even thousands of spectators. In Markle, the county extension agent planned the proceedings to educate spectators about the reproductive threat of scrub bulls. The bull's ordeal then capped Better Bull Day in Markle, a day that began with expert lectures on the value of purebred sires and the ceremonial donation of a purebred bull drawn from the private stock of the president of the Erie Railroad. Markle sat on the Erie Railroad. And therefore, promises of purebred prosperity began the day, but the scrub's execution and internment ended it. In this way, trials of scrub sires demonstrated how purebred life connected to scrub death. More broadly, the trials in the campaign linked capitalist logics of value to governance of reproduction, populations, and racialized violence. Scrub livestock eradication programs circulated knowledge about livestock breeding and food production, that much is obvious, but the campaign also educated rural publics about the threat posed by the reproduction of eugenically unfit persons, as well as the capacities of the state to effectively govern life, that is, human and non-human alike. Scrub eradication reveals then an unexpected link between the history of livestock production and the history of race in the United States. I'm arguing that infrastructures of meat making acted as conduits for eugenic logics and advanced what historians Barbara Fields and Karen Fields term racecraft. Racecraft is, quote, the social alchemy that transforms racism into race, disguising collective social practice as inborn individual traits. This is a definition I'll come back to over the course of the talk. This definition emphasizes that race is therefore a fantastical symbolic category that is nevertheless inscribed on actual material bodies through practice. Many early 20th century Americans crafted race not only through their treatment of humans, but also by talking about and acting on livestock animals. And livestock breeding provided an unusually rich field for racecraft in the early 20th century, precisely because it was a popular arena for millions of Americans to explore the interrelations among inheritance, value, and reproduction, questions central to human race. It was therefore a vast laboratory for Americans to experiment with the qualified reproduction of life. I argue that attention then to both the symbolic and material value of non-human animals is necessary to properly attend to the ways in which they have been interwoven with human racecraft. Livestock animals functioned as symbols and metaphors through which people understood differences among humans. Importantly, though, they also retained obvious material value. as vital commodities, as capital, and as energy sources. Economic speculation is inherently grounded in symbolic value. A present object symbolizes its future value. And in this sense, the pervasive material presence of livestock animals in early 20th century America informed and enhanced the symbolic currency of livestock as objects capable of carrying racial meanings. Animals functioned as practical, didactic objects that instructed people about the reproduction of value, how to preserve the pure value of some life, and how to limit the reproduction of and eradicate altogether wasteful, degenerate, and contaminating forms of life. So the breeding of domesticated animals has been diffuse and popular in North America since at least European colonization, but it had not always been intensive. Prior to the Civil War, with few exceptions, livestock breeding in the United States was dominated by breeding practices in which farmers exerted minimal control over selection and reproduction. Such extensive breeding regimes were necessary in landscapes where, absent fences and barns, animals moved, grazed, and mated freely. And in the decades after the Civil War, a national infrastructure in meat and dairy production drove land enclosure, fencing, and animal confinement. With regiment and spatial organization, farmers shifted from extensive to intensive livestock breeding. Intensive breeding entailed selecting which animals bred and closely supervising the mating. I go into this in much greater detail in the Race Suicide Among the Hogs to talk about how they viscerally, in sticky ways, supervised the mating. Popular reception of Darwinism and growing emphasis on the role of inheritance in biological development meant that breeders scrupulously tracked the lineages of breeding animals, intent on conserving and refining advantageous traits and what they termed pure blood. Non-human life had always functioned as a factor of production, but this system meant that livestock could also increasingly function as capital. Livestock breeders conceived of the value of their animals not just in terms of the products of a given animal's body, be it energy, meat, milk, tallow, hide, or eggs, that is, as a factor of production, but also in terms of the speculative value of the forms of life the animal was capable of reproducing. This shift led to the formation of national breed associations in beef, dairy, pork, and poultry breeding and a robust pure breeding culture by the turn of the century, and therefore at conventions, expositions, and fairs, in magazines and newspapers, and on nations' millions of farms, breeders pondered how to harness and direct the reproduction of their stock. Breeders sold purebred animals to an enormous and growing market of farmers. Livestock agriculture was a vast sector of the national economy at the turn of the 20th century, far larger than we recognize today, with the nation's livestock accounting for roughly 4.3% of the nation's total wealth in 1900. And by context, that's more than the entire capitalized value of the nation's railroads at the time. It's the second largest category of wealth after land. Enamored of fantastic promises of pure breeding, breeders, bankers, packers, and husbandry experts argued that better reproductive governance would increase the value of livestock and therefore broadly improve the productivity of all American farms. And within this context, scrub sires often appeared as figures whose bodily presence threatened the health of the herd and the nation's livestock because of bad blood and genetic inferiority. This presence called not for more careful governance, but for wholesale eradication from breeding stock. To experts, scrub sires presented a dire collective undervaluing of reproduction by farmers. Scrubs might be prolific because they were cheap, but their inferior offspring dragged down the value of the herd, resulting in losses that exceeded the extra costs of better studs. Many American livestock breeders, these experts argued, did not adequately appreciate the importance of the universal, quote, principles of better breeding to the herd and to the nation, and that failure demanded urgent attention. Shared inquiry then among breeders and race scientists into questions of value in its reproduction crafted alliances and practical affinities. These linkages extended the reach of eugenics and race science in early 20th century American life through a burgeoning infrastructure of meat making. Scientific racists and eugenicists often cited livestock breeding as a model for what could be accomplished through the careful governance of reproduction. They argued that the practical accomplishments of livestock breeders proved the underlying validity of the universality of their principles of breeding. The example of livestock breeders, they argued, justified a variety of government policies, including government approval of marriage and reproduction, immigration restrictions, and compulsory sterilizations, perhaps most famously. Arguments that cited agricultural expertise often invoked the contrast between purebred livestock and scrubs, with the former an exemplar of the scientific management of breeding, and the latter an example of the menace of unmanaged breeding and consequent racial degeneracy. The USDA and its allies in particular popularly circulated precisely this contrast through the campaign and scrub trials. So finally then, the campaign helps us make sense of why the USDA Extension Service and many farmers continued to promote pure breeding even after the advent of breeding protocols that eschewed emphasis on lineage. Race science and eugenics achieved widespread popularity and political influence in the United States by the 1920s. With the figures of the purebred and the scrub imbricated with popular race science through the campaign, critics in the livestock breeding industry found purebreeding difficult to displace. This is because purebreeding dovetailed with popular essentialist understandings of race as a hereditary biological category. And critics of purebreeding correctly argued that breeds had been fantastically concocted in the 19th century around arbitrary phenotypical characteristics that offered farmers little insight into the value of the animals in question as actual sort of capitalist creatures. That the USDA and so many farmers refused to abandon these fantastic categories suggests that early 20th century race science proved to be an intractable foundation for 20th century agriculture and a structuring logic of the global food system. Then as now, the life at stake in the governance of reproduction was always more than human, just as the life at stake in capitalist enterprise was always more than animal. Part 1, the meat economy. So by 1900, a national livestock infrastructure spanned the entirety of the North American continent. Rapid agricultural expansion after the Civil War, sustained by the Homestead Acts and the railroad construction, put millions of acres of land into cultivation. Even on smaller farms growing staple commodity crops such as wheat and corn, livestock emerged as one of the most efficient and lucrative ways to extract value from land. Of course, the nation's different agricultural regions retained specific livestock economies. Beef cattle fed on grass predominated in the high plains, swine in the Middle West and Corn Belt, dairy cattle in New England and around the Great Lakes, and a mix of animals on the farms of the Deep South and Middle Atlantic. The nation's rails knitted these disparate regions together. A single animal might graze on western grasslands, be fatted on dent corn in Illinois, slaughtered in Chicago's Union stockyards, and then transported as a side of beef to New York City, or barreled and bound on a steamer for sale in Europe. While animal substances appeared in markets as discrete products, steaks, bacon, tallow, lard, milk, cheese, hides, and eggs, the productive processes of all of these items were actually interwoven. For example, in the Corn Belt, dairy farmers sold excess male offspring of their cows to be fattened on corn farms. That's veal. Just as this value chain tightened links between animal flesh and value, railroads and refrigeration also expanded the so-called milk sheds of urban centers, generating first regional, then eventually national and global markets in dairy products tied intrinsically as well to the meat economy. Global markets played an increasingly important role in all of this livestock production. Animal products connected internal peripheries to commodity chains spanning American empire and the globe, as Christine Jorgensen has famously argued. By the late 1870s, live animals, meat, lard, and other animal products made up roughly 1/5 of all US merchandise exports to Europe. And by 1883, the nation's 47 million head of cattle dwarfed Great Britain's 6 million. Similarly, 37 million swine resided in the United States compared to 27 million in all of Western Europe. So the comparison here is the United States is at the center of the global meat economy even by the end of the 19th century. Western ranches, livestock farms, and stockyards attracted serious attention and investment, not only from Eastern financiers such as Charles Francis Adams Jr., but from London and Paris as well. And flush with capital and spurred by newly formed Livestock Breed Association, American farmers imported tens of thousands of European livestock to improve their herds. For cattle breeders, improvement was synonymous with breeding traits in, like short horns and higher body fat percentages, and breeding out long horns, long limbs, and muscularity. Pig breeders bred in stout, heavier European pigs and bred out any swine that resembled the rangy, tusked razorback. In both cases, improved livestock were animals that were better fitted for the tight spaces of the national meat infrastructure and that quickly and efficiently put on weight. So the global circulation of animals, meat, and lard created thorny problems for government officials. Veterinary and zoonotic illness spread rapidly with live animals, bringing physical devastation and economic cataclysm. Similarly, as meat and lard increased in value as export commodities, tainted or adulterated products could ruin the national reputation and bring retaliatory tariffs and bans. Recurring epidemics of contagious bovine pleuropneumonia and Texas fever among US cattle spurred Congress to create an entire federal agency to supervise livestock and meat production in 1884. The Bureau of Animal Industry, or BAI, was housed in the Department of Agriculture. President Chester Arthur appointed veterinary scientist Daniel Solomon to head the new agency, which reflected the Bureau's primary responsibility of addressing diseases endemic to livestock production. The BAA primarily addressed this responsibility by organizing eradication campaigns in which the government quarantined, purchased, and destroyed infected livestock animals, an approach they called area eradication. You can go through the sort of steps of area eradication here. That would become famous and innovative as a model for other public health officials. And in 1892, the BAI announced the successful eradication of contagious bovine pleuropneumonia in the United States. And that eradication campaign in particular laid the groundwork for future disease eradication campaigns in the United States, including Texas fever, hog cholera, bovine tuberculosis, and then eventually human smallpox, which is directly modeled off of the BAI model. So although the BAI primarily focused on veterinary medicine and food safety, the agency also researched animal breeding, a task that institutionally entangled it with the human eugenics movement. Beginning in 1901 with the formation of the Division of Animal Husbandry within the Bureau, BAI employees conducted and supported research on livestock breeding, inheritance, and genetics. The Division of Animal Husbandry offered a key node of exchange between, on the one hand, geneticists and eugenicists, and on the other hand, experts preoccupied with veterinary disease eradication. Horse breeder George Rommel headed the division and devoted a substantial amount of resources to the improvement of the Morgan horse, a breed of lighter steeds with important military applications for the cavalry, although sort of a foolish investment prior to the First World War for obvious reasons. Nevertheless, Rommel was also an early member of the American Breeders Association, an organization dedicated to the improved breeding of animals, plants, and humans. In 1914, the organization rechristened itself the American Genetics Association and changed the name of its magazine from the American Breeders Magazine to the Journal of Heredity. The Journal of Heredity would continue as the major venue for eugenic scholarship well into the post-war period, and Rommel expanded his role in the organization through the 19-teens, eventually becoming its secretary, a position he held until his retirement in 1923. And to show how closely interwoven these institutional ties are between the Bureau of Animal Industry and the American Genetics Association, his successor at the chief of the Division of Animal Husbandry, a guy by the name of E.W. Sheets, then also stepped into Rommel's position as secretary of the AGA in the same year. So they basically replaced a USDA official as their secretary. In 1920, in fact, a majority of the governing council of the AGA was directly employed by the US Department of Agriculture, including its president, the botanist and plant prospector, David Fairchild. So the eugenicists in the USDA formed a kind of thick network linking livestock research programs and organizations advocating for human eugenics. Disease eradication and eugenic racial theory then collided in spectacular fashion in the Better Sires, Better Stock campaign by reframing livestock improvement as the spatialized eradication of inferior male animals. Part 2, Better Sires, Better Stock. The BAI launched the Better Sires, Better Stock campaign officially in October of 1919 to fanfare and generous publicity. Announcements of the campaign ran in newspapers around the country, and the glowing publicity quickly established it as among the most popular BAI programs. People loved it. Instead of disease eradication, here was something that was addressing itself to making more profitable animals. In fact, even the White House was enrolled, with representatives of President Wilson pledging to allow only purebred rams among the sheep that grazed the lawn. And on top of it all, the glowing publicity was cheap. The campaign was funded out of the Bureau's existing office budget and relied heavily on the Cooperative Extension Service to implement and supervise the campaign on the ground. So generally, the BAI's experts generated content and planned the campaign, and it was then distributed through the Cooperative Extension Service, county agents who were subsidized by the federal government, but also by state and local funds. Although Moeller, Rommel, Sheets, and the BAI's editor, D.S. Birch, officially authored most of the campaign's material, they actively sought input on campaign literature directly from prominent geneticists and eugenicists of the day. So the campaign's central objective was to educate livestock and dairy farmers about how to efficiently manage reproduction of the herds and flocks in ways that would contribute to increased productivity. The campaign launched at a moment of relative prosperity for American farmers, but the 1920s proved to be a calamitous decade for agriculture. During World War I, agricultural commodity prices skyrocketed, driven by price supports from the US government and declining production in Europe. Recognizing agriculture's value to the war effort, the USDA encouraged farmers to capitalize on the high prices by expanding their operations with debt-financed purchases of land, machinery, and supplies, and animals as well. The collapse of agricultural commodity prices in the 1920s then launched waves of farm foreclosures. Low prices, high rates of foreclosure, and general turbulence in the agricultural sector persisted over the decades. So historians say that in rural America, the Great Depression actually begins in the middle of the 1920s rather than at the end of the 1920s. And this economic turbulence, however, did little to dislodge the USDA's productionist mindset. And increasing production was the primary advice proffered to farmers before and after the price collapse, which happens in 1921. Government efforts to relieve distressed farmers prior to the New Deal were mostly limited to educational programs and the promotion of marketing and production cooperatives. USDA experts hoped these initiatives would encourage more efficient production and farm management practices among smaller farmers in particular, and ostensibly farmers could make capital investments in breeding stock to increase production of meat, dairy, eggs, and lard. Accordingly, the BAI aggressively promoted both pure breeding and boar, bull, and cock breeding cooperatives to heal the ailing agricultural economy. BAI experts hoped the increased use of purebred sires through such cooperation would mean the decreased use of marginal scrub sires. And the word scrub had a larger cultural life in the 19th century United States, meaning generally low or inferior. And farmers sometimes used it to refer to undesirable livestock. So in the late 19th century, however, the appellation scrub sire increasingly drew hereditary distinctions specified by pure breeding culture. In other words, it develops its meaning specifically in relationship to pure breed. For pure breeders, breed was a mix of phenotype and registered lineage. The USDA land-grant colleges, fair associations, breeding societies, and agricultural press tended to debate and regulate phenotypical breed characteristics, gradually adjusting the definitions and differences over time. In the United States, national breed associations first emerged in the final 3 decades of the 19th century, beginning with the American Berkshires Association in 1875. Through national associations, breeders tracked lineage and potentially valuable better blood through the widespread use of pedigrees and standard herd books. Where lineage was clear in the animal's body fit, farmers and breeders could pay a fee to register an animal as purebred in a breed herd book. Where it was not, farmers classed the animal as grade, crossbred, or scrub. So the USDA defined crossbreds as the progeny of purebred parents of different breeds, while a grade was the get of a pairing of a purebred with any animal that was not purebred. A scrub, however, was an animal of mixed or unknown breeding without definite type or markings. Such terms as native, mongrel, razorback, dunghill, piney woods, that would be local to Virginia, cayuse, bronco, and mustang are somewhat synonymous with scrub, although many of the animals described by these terms have a certain fixity of type, even though they present no evidence of systemic improved breeding. Above all else then, scrub bodies indicated ungoverned reproduction. Whatever phenotypical conformity such animals displayed was always evidence not of improvement, but of regression and degeneration towards feral, undomesticated, and quote, native animals. In fact, the campaign's frequent conflations of scrubs with native animals indexed the assumption that indigenous societies practiced only open range management and extensive breeding on grass. Rangier animals thrived on long drives, but by 1920, most American ranges had actually been closed for decades or longer. Targets of the campaign were not ranchers engineering cattle drives over hundreds of miles. They were mostly landed white farmers in the Middle West, South, and East who raised livestock alongside staple crops or integrated into staple crop farms. Rangy native animals were obsolete in such a context. Toughness, fear, and fierceness might be virtues on the range, but those characteristics were biological anachronisms fitted for nomadic existence on the periphery of civilization. Again, our civilizational and kind of racial discourse coming in. That the animal in question had been originally introduced by European colonizers was rather beside the point, since razorbacks and longhorns had ostensibly degenerated under the lax conditions of reproductive governance that the frontier's notoriously racially mixed populations practiced. Regardless, campaign material usually characterized native-blooded animals as a starting point from which breeders could work, biological material that could be improved with European cattle and pigs. And so, as the temporal predecessor of American livestock, native animals were, quote, somewhat synonymous with scrubs, but in the present, scrubs appeared as a menacing threat capable of contaminating the blood of the nation's herds. BAI experts sometimes directly appealed to the idea that human racial governance and livestock breeding were then related practices. Historians Barbara Kimmelman, Laura Lovett, and Colin Johnson, among others, have shown that eugenicists ground their claims to authority on the basis of agricultural expertise. For example, in the first issue of the Journal of Heredity, Charles B. Davenport, America's most prominent eugenicist, amidst praise for our, quote, best plant and animal breeders, suggested that conscientious readers should obtain from the Eugenic Records Office at Cold Springs Harbor blank family records pedigrees to fill out in return. The ERO compiled, in fact, a vast archive of these pedigrees. In 1927, D.A. Birch, that's our man in the BAI, would write to Harry Laughlin, the superintendent of the Eugenics Record Office and eventual architect of California's eugenic sterilization law, and asked if lessons from the human pedigree work should inform the USDA's livestock improvement campaigns. Laughlin replied with encouragement. There is a closer relation between the registration of domestic animals and the analysis of human pedigrees than most people realize, he said. Similarly, Joseph W. Wilson, a Nevada extension agent, planned to, quote, use heredoscopes, which are sold by the American Genetic Association, in connection with a talk on purebred sires. Similarly, when Wilson wrote to the BAI for information on livestock genetics, C.D. Lowe, also of the Bureau of Animal Industry, responded with a lengthy excerpt from The Basis of Breeding by Leon P. Whitney, the president of the American Eugenics Society, that covered such things as recessive traits ranging from Jewish facial types and music ability in humans to milk yield and spotting in cattle. So eugenicists familiar with livestock breeding practices recognized that to literally breed humans like livestock required systematizing polygamy and incest. So as a result, elite eugenicists tried to quash agricultural analogies that cast the pall of sex radicalism. These cautions, however, were frequently lost in popular translation, where agriculture and livestock metaphors continued to be an important way of translating and proving eugenic expertise to lay audiences. In 1926 and 1927, for example, the American Eugenics Society sponsored a national eugenics sermon contest. The contest asked entrants to preach sermons at churches that explained the compatibility of human eugenics and Christian devotion. The collected sermons give a really revealing window into popular eugenic translation, since the preachers addressed their sermons to large lay audiences and did so usually without any formal training in genetics. So this is lay people explaining to lay people what eugenics is. And in these sermons, agricultural and livestock metaphors remained the most common way of explaining how and why eugenics worked, even when in doing so they explicitly contravened the warnings of the American Eugenics Society about sex radicalism. For example, W.P. Lemon's sermon to the American Presbyterian Church of Minneapolis in 1927 reversed the typical relation of the livestock analogy by pondering how catastrophic it would be to breed animals like humans. Suppose we applied the methods we use in breeding our children to our breeding of livestock. We should then allow every individual in the herd to breed, sterilizing none. The weaklings and deformed would receive special care and be permitted to propagate. Polygamous and consanguineous unions would be forbidden by law. Every animal would be left free to choose its own mate for life. Under such conditions, stock raising would be reduced to the standard of the early American Indian. Again, circling back to our native point. So with this thought experiment conducted, Lemon concluded that it was imperative to apply the insights of livestock breeding in the form of eugenics to human populations, which is like incredibly, it's like he comes to the exact opposite way that you would think the analogy would work, right? You would be like, oh, boy, eugenics is, like well, we do terrible things to animals, I guess. But no, that's not. He says we should use these practices to improve our reproduction of humans. But most eugenicists were more circumspect and simply cited how the USDA's investment in improved livestock had paid tangible benefits to farmers across the nation. Less often, but by no means uncommon, such appeals made explicit use of the contrast between scrubs and purebreds that was being circulated by the campaign. No farmer believes in breeding from scrubs, but from pure blood or certified and pedigreed stock. Why? Pondered Frederick Adams before the congregation of the United Church of Heinsberg in Vermont in 1926. The answer? Because they have been bred up to a standard the best traits have been conserved by proper mating. So the BAI and its allies echoed this rhetoric of blood purity and material related to the campaign. There is not a farmer in the country whose status would not be improved by purifying the blood of his farm animals of every type and keeping it pure, explained an article about the campaign in the Atlanta Constitution, drawn directly from publicity material authored by the USDA. So discussion of better and pure blood linked directly with other conversations among farmers and breeders about how breeds acted as races, and in these discussions they directly applied explicitly racial logics to different breeds' economic and demographic I talk about this in the race suicide article if you're more interested in it. But regardless, the agricultural press frequently wrote of both animal races and race suicides in language strikingly similar to the copious breathless commentaries on the alleged reproductive slump of white Anglo-Saxon manhood made famous by Teddy Roosevelt in 1907. Just as with contemporaneous discourses of human race suicide, animal breeding attached reproduction to racial ascents and declines. Once the use of purebred sires becomes general throughout the country, the process of grading up will be rapid, wrote Moeller. The first poster generated by the campaign, "Which Way Is Your Livestock Going?" aptly captured the sense of futurity in Moeller's words, but gestured at a collective body greater than just the herd. A line of robust purebreds paraded upward to a fruitful, orderly farm, while a glum march of emaciated, bent scrubs trudged down to a barren, broken homestead. And in this sense, the poster linked the biological improvement of animals to healthy landscapes and farms, and explicated the interweaving of human and animal fates embedded within the concept of improvement. However, the particular ends toward which bodies, collective and individual, were progressing depended on both aesthetic or fancy points and economic functional points. Different breeds had different uses. A Holstein was a fine dairy cow, but she made for expensive steak. For a dairy farmer, a single bull was sufficient breeding stock. If they could not be sold or rented on another farm, surplus bulls, even purebreds, were castrated and sent to the feedlot. So for all breeding stock, dams typically outnumbered sires by ratios of 20 to 1 or more, which explains the emphasis on sires. And on smaller farms, a farmer might forego owning any sires altogether and choose to rent a sire from a neighbor, or if it was available, a bull association. So husbandry experts often lamented that lacking a robust and systematic economy of sires, farmers tended to waste good blood. To avoid such losses, experts counseled the formation of bull associations to guarantee collective access to purebred blood. Campaign material then tended to portray female animals, scrub and purebred alike, as the passive beneficiaries of improved male sexuality rather than a locus of improvement. It depicted dairy cows as refined specimens of maternity and femininity. However, their femininity was tied to their milk-producing potential and feminine appearances, and not, like the bull, to their abilities as sexual laborers. A USDA exhibit at the 1919 National Dairy Show showcased a cow bossy, quote, dolled up in all of the finery known to cowdom, the veritable fashion plate of the animal kingdom. The USDA took a slightly different approach at the dairy show the next year when it took care, and this is post-campaign launch, to show both purebred and scrub dairy cows at their exhibit. This contrast, however, reaffirmed male sexuality as the instrument of change. Quote, "Mrs. Scrub Dairy Cow is about to break into the upper class of dairy society." This is the USDA weekly newsletter. "Madam Scrub will parade with the blue-blooded aristocracy of the cattle world." And this depiction cast Madam Scrub as a kind of class climber, scaling the social ladder through prudent marriages. She did not, quote, get into society on the strength of her own qualities. She is accepted purely on account of the merits of her mate and her progeny. Coincident with the USDA's focus on male sexuality, there was a place for Madam Scrub in the dairy aristocracy, provided she was matched exclusively with purebred males. So by contrast then, the campaign construed male sexuality as the primary locus of contamination, and it situated scrub sires as threats to collective health and vitality that demanded extraordinary violence. In the first year of the campaign alone, BAI literature called for scrubs to be eliminated, eradicated, discarded, and slaughtered, and the agricultural press used similar rhetoric. An article in the Rock Island magazine sounded downright bloodthirsty. "At present prices for purebred bulls, it is a crime to permit a scrub bull to roam the pasture. Swat him, sell him, banish him, kill him!" Exclamation points after all of this. Publicity associated with the campaign linked this violent scrub eradication to the labor of total war, remembering this is immediately after World War I. So the USDA Weekly Newsletter characteristically described bull associations as, quote, waging eternal warfare on the scrub. And similarly, and my favorite, in 1920, the USDA reported that owing to their status as, quote, enemies of good production, Wisconsin farmers sought to rename scrub bulls as Bolsheviks. Yeah, he did. This good pun, in the midst of the first Red Scare, revealed the eliminationist impulses structuring the campaign, and riffing on the menace of communist espionage, the pun mutually constructed Bolsheviks and Bolsheviks as both inescapable threats. And these threats warranted emergency action and state violence, a war carried on and against for the sake of the collective population. So such rhetoric may have suggested that scrubs were without any value. But the incentives of the campaign ensured that scrubs still had value, just not as breeding animals. Indeed, the BAI and its allies made sure that farmers had ample buyers for scrubs as meat. Returning to our area eradication protocol and noting number 3, incentives for voluntary participation. In this, the campaign structure paralleled area eradication models by subsidizing the killing of contaminated animals, or in other words, by assigning a positive value to the death of reproductively unfit animals. As with that model, the first step of the campaign was to identify and quarantine scrubs within a suitable spatial unit, and the county was the ideal unit for eradication campaigns since the Cooperative Extension Service already distributed agents in every county. Within a given county, agents conducted livestock surveys intended to produce both nationally scalable data and maps for follow-up work. In the next phase, agents pushed farmers to eliminate scrub sires by providing a range of indirect subsidies. The campaign facilitated exchanges by bringing buyers and sellers together and by helping to secure financing for purchases. Banks typically volunteered special programs to allow farmers to purchase purebred animals or to access stud fees. More broadly, the campaign's allies arranged prizes and premiums for farmers who agreed to use only purebred studs, and they also subsidized the sales of purebred studs in some cases. Across these activities, the campaign organized an array of private actors, banks, chambers of commerce, meat packers, railroads, and breeders among them, into a kind of efficient BAI infrastructure for scrub eradication. These scrub eradication efforts directly paralleled an infectious disease area eradication. The campaigns and its allies circulated and circumscribed the concepts of purebreds and scrubs as figures with specific relationships to collective vitality and health. Inferior sires were a contagious threat to the collective vitality because they passed on bad blood and stole value from herd and nation. The campaign translated then both the etiology and treatment of infectious disease into a program for governing any genetic illness deemed to pose a threat to collective health and prosperity. Eradicating livestock genetic illness fit perfectly within the area eradication model precisely because, by design, area eradication distributed labor and harnessed private violence for public ends. Part 3, the trial of the scrub sire. In the most popular public spectacle organized by the campaign, the function of the trial was clear. Like humans, animals could be brought before a court to have the truth of their bodies determined. Known as the trial of the scrub sire, county agents created a public spectacle, usually at county or state fairs, around the mock trial of a scrub sire for theft or grand larceny. Hundreds of such trials were held in every region of the country, often drawing audiences of thousands of spectators. And the BAI furnished an elaborate script for the event, replete with model cross-examinations, closing arguments, jury instructions, and a funeral oration. In organizing the event, county agents collaborated with farm bureaus, chambers of commerce, Rotary clubs, and other voluntary civil associations. Prominent citizens served as the officers of the court, a judge, sheriff, prosecutor, and defense attorney, and a jury composed of farmers. The county agent, with monetary or animal contributions from his civil society partners, obtained a scrub sire, usually a bull, but sometimes a boar, a ram, or even a cock. An indictment was drafted, naming the animal and enumerating its crimes. Organizers circulated the indictment in local newspapers and then publicized the event. On the day of the trial, the organizers brought the animal to the site of the trial, usually the county courthouse or fairgrounds, and then the trial opened. Any citizen who wished to speak for or against the scrub was afforded the opportunity, but the county agent typically testified for the prosecution and secured a number of expert farmer witnesses to do the same. Following the testimony and closing argument, the jury deliberated. In almost all cases, the scrub bull was convicted and sentenced to death. In most cases, a barbecue followed an execution, though, as D.S. Birch wrote in the trial instructions, quote, "It was impracticable to barbecue the bull, which was alive at the time of the trial, owing to the length of time required to cook the meat." Bull meat is notoriously tough. However, the barbecue will convey the impression that ultimate destination of the scrub bull is for meat purposes. So even if it tastes terrible, you're supposed to know that it's for meat. It's going to be meat. In staging a trial for a scrub bull, Birch and BII drew on an ancient practice that I'll talk more about in a moment that had been infused with renewed meaning and presence in American popular culture at the turn of the century. The trial and execution of animals for various crimes had been conducted in Europe into the early modern period by both secular and ecclesiastical courts. Historian Amy Wood notes that the practice was revived in the United States in the late 19th century to punish murderous circus elephants that had trampled humans. And like the trial of the scrub sire, large audiences attend the elephant executions, and newspapers hungrily reported on the events. But unlike elephant executions, scrub trials were not hastily improvised responses to tragedy. They were meticulously planned and scripted by the Cooperative Extension Service far in advance, precisely to buttress the USDA's claims to authority and expertise. Pickens County, South Carolina would host the first recorded scrub trial in October of 1922 before a great crowd at the county fair. The county agent, with the assistance of rural and town policemen, brought a scrub bull before Judge Jameson, and after arguments on both sides were completed, the defendant was found guilty and was sentenced to death on the block, local butchers to act as executioners. Likely inspired by the Pickens County trial, the mayor and sheriff of Statesville, North Carolina, presided over a trial, quote, carried on with due observance of the law at the county courthouse, end quote, in November of the same year. In fact, W. Kerr Scott, who would then go on to be a United States Senator and governor of North Carolina, prosecuted the bull. Reflecting growing enthusiasm for the trials, D.S. Birch at the Bureau of Animal Industry authored a comprehensive set of instructions to allow other county agents to follow the lead of North Carolina and South Carolina. The booklet was immediately in high demand, with the BAI reporting requests for 500 copies within its month of publication in March of 1924. As historian Lawrence Friedman notes, early 20th century Americans hungrily clamored for the didactic theater of spectacular headline trials. Such exceptional trials were both public and highly mediated affairs that offered the public shared text with which to dramatize the social and political controversies of the day. The BAI candidly noted that the trial's popularity hinged, quote, on the commonly recognized public interest in court news. Friedman maintains that media and public scrutiny meant that prosecutors in courts and headline trials were particularly fastidious about procedure. The didactic effect of this proceduralism instilled public faith in the consistency and fairness of trials and the broader validity of a concept still emergent in the early 20th century of rule of law. The power and capacity of the American state flowed increasingly through courts, law enforcement, and administrative hearings. Spectacular courtroom proceedings guided by didactic proceduralism, as Friedman notes, created popular support for these less public state capacities. In fact, the obsessive proceduralism of spectacular trials underwrote the banal and often perfunctory procedures, hearings, panel, and bodily inspections necessary for the operation of the American eugenic state. The BAI's scrub trials coincided with a period of peak influence for the human eugenics movement in the United States. Concerns about the dysgenic effect of immigration resulted in the passage of Highly Restrictive Immigration Act in 1924. 19 states passed new involuntary sterilization statutes or strengthened existing statutes in the decade and a half following World War I. And the Supreme Court ruled that forcible eugenic sterilizations did not contravene the constitutional guarantee of equal protection of law in Buck v. Bell in 1927. In both the case of immigration restriction and sterilization, state-certified experts, doctors, and border agents performed perfunctory inspections of human bodies to assess their reproductive fitness. In rural America, public health authorities frequently linked eugenic fitness to livestock and plant breeding at agricultural exhibitions and fairs, hosting Better Baby, Fitter Family, and 4-H health contests, where nurses, doctors, and county agents inspected and scored the bodies of contestants. The general faith in the capacity of the state to successfully execute eugenic policies hinged on the belief that experts, even without public scrutiny, would faithfully and dispassionately apply the principles of better breeding. The BAI encouraged, then, didactic proceduralism in the trials of the scrub. Despite the spectacular nature of the proceedings, the BAI always emphasized that the integrity of the, quote, medium of the trial needed to be maintained as much as possible, and that the proceedings should not devolve into, quote, a burlesque on the dignity of the law. Publicity material in newspapers often made reference to the due process of law granted to the scrub sire, assuring readers that he was given a full, quote, fair and impartial trial. Still more than a mere rhetorical gesture, the BAI did its best to preserve the adversarial elements of the judicial form in its, if not actual, due process. Birch's instructions emphasized that the officers of the court should have, quote, experience and acquaintance with court proceedings and ideally be prominent members of the local bar. Similarly, while local color and some levity should pepper the proceedings, the purpose is to hold the interest of the audience and convince listeners that purebred sires are desirable and scrub sires highly undesirable. A trial that respected procedure would ultimately prove more compelling to the audiences, and for this reason, Birch recommended that the trial be robustly adversarial. For the most part, scrub trials then played out according to the USDA's guidelines. In most cases, the agents successfully recruited judges and members of the local bar to participate, and defense attorneys relished the opportunity to put on a good show and show off their oratorical skills in defense of the bull. An ancient proceeding for defense attorneys, by the way, as we'll get into. Where trials diverged most was in the immediate fate of the defendants, and this is the practical and logistical problem. Birch's booklet encouraged the bull to be slaughtered at the conclusion of the trial, but he allowed that this probably wouldn't be practical. The expense of procuring a bull, even a scrub, could be cost-prohibitive, and many county agents simply borrowed a suitable defendant from a cooperating farmer and then returned him at the conclusion of the trial. So in those cases, such as Fairfield's Howard County trial of 1923, spectators would hear a shot but not witness an actual death, so they're going through a kind of a ritual execution that lacks actual death. Regardless, unlike the elephant trials, the trial and not the execution was the object of spectacle and the didactic instrument. The trial adjudicated the truth of the sire's body, if it was suitable for meat or for breeding, and once uncovered, the scrub sire's actual death was a banal afterthought, an unremarkable death regularly suffered by millions of other nameless animals as the meat was made. Attendees witnessed the juridical process and a reproductive valuation in a singular, spectacular event. The universality of the principles of better breeding did not mean that all species were the same. In fact, the trial's humor was often premised on differences amongst types of animals of the same species. What is the difference between a scrub bull and a purebred? Posed the prosecutor. They are alike because they both multiply, but they are different because the scrub never gets the right answer. That's the butcher answers. Biological truths uncovered by the trial marked some animals for death and meat, others for life and reproduction. Different species and different members of the same species were naturally fitted then for dramatically different social destinations. The putatively natural biological characteristic of animals' bodies endowed collective choices about how to treat those bodies with the gravity of nature, precisely, quote, disguising collective social practice as individual inborn traits, returning to the field's definition of racecraft. The scrub trial then gestured at both, on the one hand, the natural continuity of life, and on the other hand, the power of the eugenic state to divide that continuity with equally speciative and racial divisions. So like the reference to the Bolshevik, the trial of the scrub bull must be read as parody. Like all parodies, the trial of the scrub bull was balanced precariously on a blade of failure, in which either too much or too little imitation brought ruin. Too successful an imitation rendered grotesque results, an animal endowed with actual human legal personality. But too poor an imitation undercut the didactic theater of the trial. If the defense attorney was a dunce, the judge a brute, and the jury a pack of fools, spectators would be liable to take the lesson that trials, and the state that organized them, were ill-fitted to adjudicate the biological truths of bodies, much less to proffer advice about agriculture and livestock. So a burlesque undermined the state's robust claim to being able to govern the continuity of life implied by the principles of better breeding. And it especially called into question the state's capacity to distinguish differences within species. If state responses did not appear to flow dispassionately from the nature of the bodies revealed by the trial, the state, invested with ugly passion rather than expert reason, could hardly transform collective social action into inborn difference. And so the parody tacked back and forth between these poles. In this way, the scrub trial reaffirmed the capacity of the state to ascertain the truth of the body and to cloak its actions in the patina of natural speciative difference. However, the scrub trial had obvious significance for human governance. And of course, the USDA's investment in promoting state capacities was primarily mobilized by its institutional charge to manage the nation's livestock, but some participants explicitly connected the trial to human controversies. The Lewiston, Maine Sun reported about a 1929 trial that Judge Cleaves told the jury that the rule holds good in breeding of dairy animals as in the human family, that like begets like. Similarly, S.B. Cleland, a Minnesota extension worker, recommended calling human parents and their offspring to stand to demonstrate the principles of breeding at stake in the trial. In Cleland's alternative script, a runty man was called to the stand and asked to identify his sons, 3 strapping, hulking men and 3 skinny, undersized men. What appeared at first to be a rebuttal of the universal principles of breeding, however, was quickly reversed with the gag's conclusion. When asked to explain the discrepancy between himself and his sons, the man pointed out his enormous wife. The stage directions suggested having the role played by a man in women's attire for maximal comedic effect. Quote, "Yep, ain't she a dandy?" panned the man. "I may be a scrub all right, but she's a purebred if there ever was one." At a time when eugenicists openly clamored for the state to sterilize the reproductively unfit, such a confession would be remarkable and dangerous. Nevertheless, it also disclosed that the trial adjudicated not only the truth of the scrub's body, but also the capacity of the state to assess the biological truth of human bodies and manage death and reproduction accordingly. Whoops. Part 4, conclusion, anathema. A little bit of a diversion. A left turn. Trials of scrub sires sat at the confluence of race science and infrastructures of meat making, but the form of the trial itself cuts against conventional historical expectations around juridical forms. Animal trials were not uncommon in medieval and early modern Europe, but scholars often characterized animal trials as relics of pre-modern legal orders in which legal personality was not yet fully coincident with the human subject. Yet the trial of the scrub sire served as a pedagogical instrument, proving the capacities of the state to govern a domain of life that encompassed many creatures of many races and many species. Moreover, the trial's organizers fashioned themselves as modernizers, agents of science in the modern nation state. So it may be worthwhile in conclusion to consider what of the ostensibly pre-modern was preserved in scrub sire trials and what this remnant tells us about the shifting relations of life, value, reproduction, and violence impelled by the system of cheap meat. So to begin his history of animal trials, the criminal prosecution and capital punishment of animals in 1906, Edward Payson Evans reports that the 16th century famed French jurist, Barthélemy de Chasseneux, made his reputation defending rats. And though historically quite distant, Chasseneux's rats helped to clarify the fate of the scrub in the society that prosecuted him. The rats in question had eaten into a barley harvest near Autun, and so an ecclesiastical court summoned the rats to stand trial and appointed the young jurist to defend them. In view of the bad repute and notorious guilt of his clients, Evans recounts, Chasseneux was forced to employ all sorts of legal shifts and chicane, dilatory pleas, and other technical loopholes, hoping thereby to find some loophole in the meshes of law through which the accused might escape. When the rats predictably ignored the initial summons, Chasseneux effected a delay by arguing that the court had not posted adequate notice. When the rats also ignored the second summons, Chasseneux argued that the court failed to provide them with safe passage that would need to be financed by fees from the owners of the rats' mortal enemies, the cats, les chats. Popular interest in the trial had initially been quite robust, but after the court certified Chasseneux's scheme, it evaporated. After his performance, Chasseneux's reputation grew. As one of the most prominent jurists in France in the 16th century, Chasseneux published an extensive commentary and vindication of trials of animals in Concilium Primum de Excommunicatione Animalium Insectorum. That's from 1531. The first, boy, this is a real role model for all academics, the first of his 69 treatises on legal questions. The salvation of Chasseneux's rats shows just how seriously courts took the charge of providing an ordered inquest for animal transgressions. Modern scholarship on the topic has tended to break along a basic question. Does that seriousness provide a model for modern animal rights claims? Some scholars following Evans view the trials as mere ritualized barbarity that reinscribe the domination of humans over animals and nature. Other scholars contend that the ordered trial of animals in medieval and early modern courts reflected a far more capacious and nuanced understanding of animal life. Indeed, that medieval courts offered animal capacities like culpability, cognition, and moral character that contemporary legal orders deny them. On that front, historian Esther Cohen has made the most definitive study of the problem, and she notes that the trials produced human-non-human relations through a gesture often referred to in the work of Giorgio Agamben as the inclusive exclusion. That is, by claiming jurisdiction over non-human animals, courts included animals within human society, but then the same courts could then exclude animals from rights and privileges accorded to those included within society, but only if they followed closely the procedural demands imposed by the juridical form. This gesture is clearest when we understand the particular forfeit Chasseneux's rats risked at trial. Since the court was ecclesiastical, it could not levy a sentence of death. Medieval ecclesiastical courts couldn't do that. They would say, please don't kill him, prince, and then the prince would kill you. Nor would it properly excommunicate the rats, since the rats were not eligible for communion in the first place. Instead, the court could anathematize the rats. Ritual anathematization, usually reserved for heretics, cursed and excluded a class of animals from the presence of humanity, a rather strange punishment indeed for wild animals. It may be useful then to consider the term's deeper meaning. The anathema was something cursed but also seen. In ancient Greece, anathema meant the thing set up. And in its original use, it applied to items hung or displayed in the temple as offerings to the divine. Its transformation into a cursed thing tracked the practice of displaying the heads and bodies of slain foes in the temple, and then beginning in late antiquity, the figurative and ritualized designation of a person cursed by the church. Anathematization then was the operation by which an ecclesiastical court included wild animals under their spiritual authority precisely so that they could exclude those animals from spiritual community. A particular animal was made anathema to represent a class of animal who had harmed the community in some way. That is, a particular animal was made visible to curse the class of animals to which it belonged. A court need not prove that a particular rat had eaten barley to make the case that Chesnu's rats should be anathematized, but as Chesnu ingeniously recognized, the court was still bound by the strict procedure that governed anathematization. The ancient curse may indeed seem remote from the trial of the scrub sire, but anathematization substantively parallels the trial of the scrub sire. The scrub sire's crime was not particularized. He represented rather an entire class of animals that threatened the vitality of the social body, and testimony in the trial dealt with the class, not the individual. His crime was not only consistent with his nature, it was his nature and natural body. They could not be separated. The trial brought the scrub sire before a crowd and thus set up and displayed the nature of his body and the attending danger of the class of animals he represented. His death, if it was effected, was pedagogical, an illustration of how the anathematized body should be dealt with, and not, strictly speaking, a question of justice, right? It's not justice, it's pedagogy. After all, the animal represented the larger class of animals to be exterminated, but the particular scrub sire was no more nor no less deserving of death than any of the other members of his class. And in fact, his fate would be identical to all those members of his class who had not been put on trial. Finally then, the trial itself claimed universal natural law in the form of biological principles of breeding, a certain reconfiguration, perhaps, of the universal principles espoused by the Roman Catholic Church, now modernized for the 20th century as a founding basis for its proceedings. In sum, the trial anathematized a particular scrub sire to establish both the universality of those biological principles and their necessary extension to the wholesale extermination of inferior breeding stock. This process of anathema then both carved and sutured caesuras between and within species. The trial educated spectators about both the differences and similarities between scrubs and purebreds, between humans and animals, and a process that constantly both made and unmade those distinctions in a dizzying series of reversals. Yet there is at least one critical difference between the medieval anathema and the biocapitalist anathema endured by the scrub sire. Anathema adhered only to the ecclesiastical juridical form. Many animals were tried in secular courts and executed for particular crimes, but these animals were primarily domesticated animals, and it was their status as property that permitted their inclusion first in the household and second under the jurisdiction of temporal authorities. By contrast, the scrub sire always represented a class of creature understood as property. The decisive question of the trial was whether this class of creatures was appropriately deployed as capital, or whether it should be transformed into a factor of production, whether it was life worth reproducing, or whether it was life bound to be meat. Where the medieval anathema was excluded from spiritual community, the biopolitical anathema was excluded from reproduction. The trial of the scrub sire, like broader eradication campaigns, then foregrounds precisely the degree to which the life at stake in all biopolitical governance was always more than human, just as the life at stake in biocapitalist enterprise was always more than animal.
So I actually had a question based on this,
yes,
which
please.
is, so what exists by way of records? Are there transcripts? Does anybody, like, have you been able to sort of have a sense of what was said? In particular, I'm really interested in the defenses. Like, what was said on behalf of these animals?
So,
and I'm assuming there were never any acquittals.
There are, to my knowledge, 2 acquittals. One, I don't know why. I think it was a college trial, and I think that the college students thought it would be funny to acquit. And then in the other case, they explicitly, contravening USDA directions and did the number one thing you're not supposed to do in these trials, which is that you're not supposed to blame farmers. But the jury of farmers said that it was not the scrub's fault if he was bred, it was the farmer's fault.
Wow.
And so they acquitted him on that basis with the claim that the farmer was responsible or should be held responsible. But no, they are mostly almost all convictions. Mm-hmm. And the jury, the actual sort of script that the USDA provides, of course, has a conviction in the script. So it's like they weren't really encouraging people.
It wasn't choose your own adventure.
Yeah, and so the larger, so what do I have as sources? For obvious reasons, there aren't complete transcripts of the trials that are produced by contemporaries. So nobody was like writing down what was said at the trial, because a lot of it was extemporaneous or improvised. I have the existing script the USDA provided. I have several alternative scripts that people use that they want to diverge. I quoted from one by S.B. Cleland, this Minnesota one. And he tried to actually like convince the USDA that his was better, and the USDA was not having it. They thought his was pretty wild, as a matter of fact. And it is, it's a totally wild script. Some of the other like more extensive scriptings, like another one I have is actually put on by a high school. And that one is maybe the most interesting because the kids who are doing the roles of prosecutor and defendant really, really ham it up. And they ham it up in some pretty extreme ways where the prosecuting attorney positions themselves as like, we are like gods in our power. And like really like outrageous sort of like distillations of the kinds of ambitions that kind of eugenics might claim, but that you probably shouldn't say out loud because it turns people off in pretty obvious ways, and they were saying it pretty much straightforwardly. The defenses are, so this is kind of a funny thing. So for modern logics, you might think that like the prosecution has the right of it, right? You might think that this is like an obvious open and shut case, that like, indeed, it is a bad business decision to breed with a scrub bull, right? You might think that. It's nonsense. It's garbage understanding of inheritance and lineage. So what's going on here is that, indeed, scrub bulls are thrifty. They are cheap. They're really, really cheap to maintain, and that's the primary reason why farmers use them. It turns out that in classic sort of like bad race science, the USDA and the proponents of pure breeding are assigning to an essential biological category something that is much better explained by environmental factors. And so what turns out over the course of the 1920s, you get this increasing sort of animal science that then makes its appearance in the 1930s that says, number one, if you feed a scrub like you feed a purebred, they're virtually indistinguishable in terms of productivity. And so, of course, no one feeds a scrub like they feed a purebred because they look at the purebred and they go, oh, it's a really expensive animal. I better take really good care of it, like treat it really well and feed it really well. Whereas that scrub, it's a garbage animal. Like, I'll just feed it garbage, I don't care. And that's actually the primary reason why scrubs have lower rates of productivity. But there's a second point to this, which is that the whole point of like pure breeding was that there were these like essential pure good breeds that were just amazing and great. They're basically invented as like branding techniques in the 19th century, right? And so what's happening in the teens and 1920s is geneticists look at this and they go, why are you fetishizing like these physiological characteristics? They don't tell you anything about genotype, and genotype is what controls offspring. And so what you really should be doing is you should be looking at the productivity of offspring. You should be utterly indifferent to ancestry and lineage. You should be obsessed with the quality of offspring. And so there's an alternative breeding protocol that develops in contrast to pure breeding called index breeding. And index breeding starts in poultry and dairy because those are places where you have high enough sire to dam ratios where you can get statistical validity relatively quickly. And that approach is like, says we do not care about breed characteristics. We are utterly opposed to the concept of pure breeding. The only thing we want to know is which animal's offspring produces like the most milk or produces the most eggs. So what's interesting is that you don't get that kind of like sophisticated genetic argument for the defense, but you do get a pretty straightforward argument, which is that the scrub sire is inexpensive. Like he's like at a time when farmers are just trying to like squeeze by, and they're all like risking foreclosure. A purebred sire is this massive potential capital outlay that nobody wants to take on if they don't have to. And so that's the kind of like special irony about this, is that the USDA was giving really bad advice over the course of the entire 1920s. And the program, I didn't talk about this in the talk, but the program goes away in the 1930s as a result of production control and a shift in USDA. But its basic theory about breeding is already pretty much discredited by the 1930s. And it's this angry thing where geneticists are like, USDA, all the way into the 1950s, why are you obsessing about pure breeding? Mm-hmm. This is nonsense. Which, by the way, final point on this, and I've talked about this with Avir, but like, when you hear people fetishizing heritage breeds, mm-hmm. like in 2019, I just want to tell you, they are fetishizing concepts developed by bad 19th century race science. It is bad 19th century race science. Absolutely 100%. The fetishization of this thing called breed, it's nonsense. Yeah.
This might be a related question. Thank you for this talk. It's really a lively walk through something I had no clue about. But I do notice in the drama that you're presenting, it is a U.S. elite and a cow. And I'm wondering what are the other social levels that are engaged in, social groups that are engaged in this process? Because in what I'm imagining, the elites that are setting up these trials and writing up this research envision themselves as the equivalent of purebred. I mean, they're not saying so, but I think they must imagine that. But we know that this is a decade and or an entire half century full of debates over what white ethnicity is, what marginal ethnicities. Like I'm thinking of in my field the Supreme Court cases over Tind and Ozawa, arguing for Asian American whiteness in different ways.
Right.
And there must be people who are not pure breeds or conscious of their being in the butt of this eugenics discourse, doing some of the actual animal husbandry and carrying out of this. And I'm just wondering, like, is there do they recognize that? Like, oh crap, this discourse implicates me and I'm not on the right side of the discourse? Or are people sort of utilizing it, I guess like in the case of Ozawa and Tin, to say like, we are actually quite pure in other ways, but you just have to use an alternate model to see that, or something.
I have the exact parallel questions that I was going to ask, which is this white people talking to white people as white people about better breeding? And are these trials segregated?
Right.
Like in the sort of the space of the audience, is this a segregated space? And I just want to flag, like you're talking about anathema at at a moment of lynching. So, I'd love to hear your answer to this question.
Where the black farmers were, the Asian American farmers were, the Latinx farmers.
Who's doing the racial labor?
So it
farmers.
is, I mean, I would say that the most straightforward reading of this is that it's predominantly white experts talking to white farmers across class and using essentially an implicit language, an implicit rhetoric of white supremacy as a way of enrolling them in a particular kind of agricultural model that may in fact be against their economic interests. So one way of talking about this is that like the story of farming between 1900 and 1950, at least in the United States, is that it gets considerably less racially diverse. This is a period of like consolidation where when marginal farmers are pushed out, they are overwhelmingly African American farmers. This is a period of the Great Migration. It's a period of an out exodus of farmers from the American South. And so like part of the story here is about the consolidation of a particular model of farming around whiteness and the way in which the USDA tends to sidestep these kinds of critical like class problems. I mean, there's a real class that this is, like you would think that this would create a big divide on the basis of class where poor farmers would be like, hey, we're targeted for eugenic sterilization, or like we're also lumped into the unfit to reproduce. And yet the binding power of like the promise of whiteness seems to outweigh class differences in pretty profound ways. I can't, unfortunately, my sources don't answer the question of the segregation of racial spaces around anathema. I've tried to talk about it alongside lynching, and yet have not found a way to do it that I think is clarifying or produces any sort of produces any insight about the situation that also attends to, I think, the ethical problems of representations of lynching. I will say that the Cleland script that I quote explicitly references and marks lynching. Although the trial of the scrub sire is positioned as an alternative to lynching, and it's buttressed as that the idea is that the trial is superior because if we don't do the trial, then private violence will be enacted. So,
do you have the locations where these trials were enacted and have these actual theaters or wherever they took place, high schools that were racially organized? I mean, you could surely gather some of that.
I mean, they're almost all happening at county courthouses and county fairgrounds, which in most of those cases are indeed segregated. Although the problem is that they're done outside often. In those cases, it's difficult to tell like how exactly they would segregate, although they probably would. It's also the case that like it's not just happening in the American South. It's also happening in it's happening in all sorts of places where the modes of like racial segregation are more implicit and less explicit in terms of how that works out.
Were they ever photographed these particular trials? Do you?
Those are the 3 existing photographs I have. Yeah.
So if I'm understanding correctly, no one who is a poor white is thinking to themselves, I'm the target of this.
I mean, ironically, no. That's part of the thing is that they bury it in this agrarian rhetoric that is supposed to appeal across class and that is so racialized in sort of like the late 19th century as this the figure of the heart of the American Republic as the farmer. It's the white landed farmer in particular. That like it doesn't tend to set people off in that way. I mean, and there's tremendous amounts of ironies. Like one of the people I look at really closely, Hubert Goodale, who's one of the primary proponents of index breeding, but is also a totally enthusiastic eugenicist. It's a lifelong struggle with mental illnesses that would clearly have him classed, according to eugenic authorities, as someone who is like unfit to reproduce. This is actually remarkably common amongst eugenicists, that they're absolutely like avowed about the reproductivity of it, and most of them don't see the ways in which they could cut against them. It also just happens to be the case that as like a common logic, eugenics has an incredible cross-class appeal. And in fact, it also has like not just cross-economic classes, it's a cross-racial class. W. Du Bois, for a long period of his career, is also active in the American Breeders Association, and collaborates with Charles Davenport initially on like hybridity issues. This is something that I think Kyla Schuler writes about. There are feminist eugenicists. It winds up being a really flexible sort of logic where you can, if like you place yourself as fit, you can see the appeal to it and you get folded into it, even when in actual practice, the way that eugenic violence is actually carried on in society is neither particularly scientific and neither particularly expertise, and certainly doesn't hold up the interests of like the poor or people of color. Like those are obviously and actively people who experience violence as a result of eugenic policies. But I think there's a major sort of distinction between eugenics as it works its way out in terms of how the violence is actually executed and what's mobilizing that violence and what explains that violence in a lot of ways, and intellectual logics of eugenics that serve as a kind of buttress for it. Like, I would argue that the actual history of like eugenic sterilization, for example, has absolutely no relationship to like any sort of scientific understanding of human reproduction. And that much is evident, absolutely evident by like 1920. Like the people who are doing it, to the extent that they cite science to justify what they're doing, it's absolute nonsense, pseudoscience, that no actual practicing scientists actually like adhere to. But I mean, like the actual execution of these policies, usually pretty like blatant, obvious racism and classism. Yeah.
So you talked a lot about wild animals and then the frontier, which are like the movement westward, which then made me think a little bit about Native Americans and buffaloes. And I should actually know this name, but I don't. I'm just wondering, like, if there's a link between when we think about like the logic of eugenicists and eugenic knowledge and the like genocide against Native Americans and the loss of buffaloes, like if they're talking about buffaloes at all, it's like, well, these are like wild cows and like we need to take care of that problem too, because it poses this kind of threat. So I'm just wondering if there's a way that they like are pointing towards some of what's going on to say like, well, we can solve the problem of the cows just like we solved the problem of the buffalo.
That's an interesting question. You know, I don't think that the buffalo makes much of an appearance in my sources, and I would wonder if I asked them about it. I will say that the sort of like, there's a much deeper history towards, in terms of like the racialization of semi-feral animals and the ways in which they get marked as usually like attached to sort of like racially suspect populations. So the history here is that like what are called now longhorns, Texas longhorns, are also typically referred to contemporaneously as Mexican cattle or Indian cattle. And that's the first part of it. That in both Texas and a number of western states, there are laws that are passed mostly between 1890 and about 1920 that forbid you to publicly stud a quote Mexican or Indian cattle. And the idea there is that like there's a recognition that indigenous and like mixed race populations in the American Southwest and the American West were practicing animal agriculture. They weren't just like hunting wild buffalo, they were actually practicing wild agriculture. The issue was that because they were quote barbaric and uncivilized, that they didn't know practices of selective breeding, and therefore they weren't capable of producing a refined animal, and that if you wanted a refined animal, you needed to bring it in from Europe. And then sometimes there were other arguments about like crossbreeding them and getting like the vigor of like the American animal and crossbreeding it with the refinement of the European animal. But that's a sort of specialized and complicated argument that it goes a lot of different ways. But I wish I knew more about how they would have talked about buffaloes. I can speak more about the question of indigenous populations, but I don't know a lot about buffaloes.
This was fascinating. I was struck by the focus on the male bulls. And I mean, you mentioned that the femininity of the cow is tied to like milk production, not reproduction. But I'm curious, given, you know, we can certainly imagine the ways that this could have been put on the cows rather than the bulls. If you have anything to say about sort of what was at play in terms of gender more broadly, that guys are the problem. And I'm thinking here a little bit about Gail Biederman's distinction, you know, about the sort of transition from this middle-class moral manliness to a working-class sexualized, physicalized masculinity. You know, is that, anyway, I'm just interested in hearing more about
so the
kind of how the gender politics of society
there
there.
There may be a larger answer to it, but I'm actually going to give you the really, really straightforward and kind of tedious economic answer, which is that because of the structure of American agriculture, the dam to sire ratio means that like you would have to spend, so if genetic like contribution is always 1-to-1 male to female, you are 20 times more cost effective by investing in your male animal than you are in your female animal.
Because you're breeding it.
Yeah, because that male animal is going to breed with 20 dams, whereas if you buy one better cow.
Right, that's only one.
Yeah, and so there are other like you get this sort of like counter narratives and counter discourses where they want to say things like, oh, well, you should improve your cow too, but like and like if you've got extra surplus capital, maybe you get some better cows, or like try to breed up your cows as well. But there's like an easy recognition that like the economics just implicit in a structure of 1 male to 20 females mean that the male is going to be the locus of improvement. Now it does of course dovetail with larger scripts around sexuality and larger scripts about like sexed bodies. This is something I talk about not necessarily in this article, but in some of my other work. But it's pretty evident that breeders like identify with their male animals in ways that appoint male sexuality, and I would say the care and nurturing of male sexuality, as a primary logistical issue, which is that they're constantly worried about how they're going to stoke the desire of their boars to like do the reproductive labor they need the boars to do, whereas they conceptualize it essentially like the sow's body as a passive like space of non-sex that just gets impregnated. It turns out, and we know this by the end of the 20th century, that like that's the exact, not the exact opposite, but like it flips. There's all this animal science about how sows have higher, tend to have like larger litters, but also have higher, like basically higher fertility on the balance if they're aroused during insemination. And so there's this reversal, whereas like breeders in the early 20th century are totally invested in figuring out how to stimulate the boar's body to affect it to be a more like powerful and potent and virile sexual laborer. The end of the 20th century is a total reversal. The boar, there's like one boar basically to thousands and thousands of sires, or pardon me, to dams, and he's just like hooked up to an electric like prostate stimulating machine and just milked. Like it's just like a totally mechanized process, and they get as much semen as they can from the boar, and that's the last bit you'll ever know of the boar, right? Whereas the sow's body then becomes this intense site of techno-capital investment. We're figuring out what arousal means, what it means in terms of bodily sensation, in terms of hormones and pheromones, and all these different issues. And you need all sorts of like technical procedures to figure out how to produce sows that are aroused, which then gets re-scripted as simulating natural sex. Though of course it bears absolutely no resemblance whatsoever to what a boar and a sow would do if they were left to their own devices in a pasture. But the conceit there is that the sow is tricked, right? That when the sow is aroused, she thinks she's being impregnated by a boar, and we're foreclosing the possibility that like the sow knows that it's a human technician, and the sow is like, this human technician is like way better than that boar. Like this human technician knows what's up, like knows its way around the body. And that's like a statement about like how we really have a difficult time of conceptualizing even at this point, sort of like animal sexuality in the fullest, most robust sense that's necessary to conceptualize within agricultural spaces, and we lack the intellectual mechanisms to do that.
So I think at that intersection of human and animal sex and sex acts, I'm looking at the time and we're out of it, but so if you'll join me in thanking Professor Rosenberg.